Anytime that you're thinking about conflict resolution, you have to give some thought to a particular category of conflict, and this is a crisis. Have you ever thought, what really is a crisis? What makes a crisis, and why is it important? Seems like it's important. Oftentimes everybody seems to get pretty excited when you have a crisis, and why is that? It turns out there's some very important reasons. Now first, what is a crisis? Well, a crisis is any situation, let's use the example between governments of two states. And first, whatever prompts the crisis comes across as a surprise. It catches usually one side by surprise because the other side has initiated the action. In addition to being a surprise, it is something you perceive as really important. You might say vital to your national security, so there becomes an element of threat. You feel threatened. So you're surprised and you're threatened. Not a good situation for calm decision making and conflict resolution. And then the third quality is that you perceive there is a deadline in which you must make a decision to resolve the crisis in a very short amount of time. It's looming. So once again, a surprise event occurs. You perceive it as very important to your national security and thus feel threatened, and you must take some action before a certain perceived deadline, or you're pretty sure something really bad will happen. Now, it turns out that under crisis situations, which have been studied extensively, there are some decision-making factors that come into the equation that aren't present when everyone is calmly sitting around a table and you're under a more normal set of negotiations. In short, the acknowledgement of a crisis, that is to say, because sometimes it can just be perceived, it can be in your mind, but that's enough. If you perceive that something is a crisis, the decision-making dynamics change. Very briefly, first, you must act quickly. So automatically, a lot of the government, security organizations, apparatus doesn't get to participate because there's no time to bring all the stakeholders in. So a small group of usually very important people, the principals in our country, President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, for instance, are together literally making decisions minute by minute to beat this looming deadline and either avert the crisis or have it turn out the way we would like to see it turn out. It turns out that when small groups become involved in high-stakes issues, a few things happen that degrade the quality of decision-making. A lot of it has to do with, we all probably can think of cases in which we were made members of some organization that we really valued. We feel very special. We do not want to lose the allegiance of that organization. We do not want to be thrown out of that organization. So in terms of a crisis where high government officials are making decisions, each official, whether they acknowledge it or not, want to stay on the team. And at some point, since action is needed rapidly, you either have to agree or disagree with the course of actions being taken. It turns out that there is a phenomenon called groupthink. And what happens when you are in these high-stakes situations and you begin down a certain road towards certain decisions, you sort of feel a strong incentive to agree. If you disagree, people tend to rule you out. You might even be banned from the group. There are several well-studied historical examples where this is counted. So think about that. You lose not only the availability of the entire government security apparatus, but you lose maybe some valuable inputs that might be right. You might be headed down the wrong course. So in short, crises are known for very suboptimal decision making. So I want to talk about a few recommendations for improving decision making during crises, and I hope you'll keep these in mind. The first thing, very important, is analyze whether a crisis actually exists. Americans, in particular, are very prey to assuming something is a crisis when it isn't. In other words, they put a lot of importance on deadlines. If something is supposed to happen by such a date, Americans try very hard to make that happen. Other cultures don't at all. I mean, they don't have that sense of time, and they can often use the American, tendency to have a great importance on deadlines to the Americans' disadvantage. So that's the first thing, especially from an American standpoint, but in any case, think about whether it's really a crisis, because remember, one of the ingredients is there's a deadline, and it's an immediate deadline. If there is no deadline, there is no crisis. Perhaps we can bring some more people in, perhaps we can analyze this better. Now this, of course, does raise a question, which I'll just offer to you and you can think about, but does that mean there is often, sometimes there are times when you should try to make another party think there is a crisis, induce an artificial crisis? Perhaps not. Remember, their decision making goes down, and so they're not as predictable as they might otherwise be. Now, if you do get into a crisis, you're in an actual crisis, there are things you can do to avoid deterioration of decision making, but it takes a little bit of self-awareness. For example, you have to consciously work to avoid groupthink. If somebody has a disagreement, give it the weight that it deserves. This person wouldn't be a high government official if they didn't have, sound judgment. Suddenly, everybody else in the room is willing to discount what they're saying. Think about that. Maybe just, somehow flag the idea that we're going to avoid groupthink. Another thing to think about is what's called mirror imaging. That means we, as an American, let's say, think that someone else, like an Iranian or a Russian, think the same way we do. They have the same values and so on and so forth. And so we act like we are having a crisis with another group of Americans who would behave somewhat predictably because we're used to how Americans respond. It's just not true. Different cultures are different. So once you're aware of the tendency to mirror image, you take steps to avoid it. Another cognitive device that we use is simplification. We try to make complex problems simple. And one of the ways we do this is by drawing on history and saying this situation is just like that situation. And once you do that, if everybody buys into it, you could be headed down a road that might not, really be that similar. So try to avoid oversimplification and pay attention to the details. And then I think the last thing I would recommend is try to avoid some cognitive errors that studies have shown we all engage in. It turns out that when you are in a crisis, you tend to view the other party as better organized than you. So you know that you're really not very well organized and you are going from minute to minute and you're in a crisis, but for whatever reason you assume that the other party is much better organized and each move that they take is based on a very well thought out situation, which usually is not true. They're in a crisis as well. We tend to assume that nothing we do scares them. In other words, we assume they don't fear us. Why? Because we're the good guys, right? But it turns out everybody thinks this way. Everybody thinks they're the good guys. And the corollary to that is they think other people are, to be feared. So those are, a couple of things we just naturally tend to think, ways we tend to think. And if you're aware of that, you can take checks to prevent it. So, crises, they happen. It is a known fact that decision making is worse under conditions of a crisis. And we do know in what ways decisions degrade. So the smart negotiating team, the smart policymaker, the smart group of high-level officials try to know what those things are and try to take active precautions to improve thinking during a crisis. While I have said that many crises are in the more of a perception thing, several are real. The one that really comes to mind is the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world truly was on the brink of strategic nuclear war. And fortunately, we pulled back from that one. But some crises are very real, and we want to have the very best decision making we can have at such times.